उनकी आवाज आ रही? हाँ. Hello. Hello,
Hi.
Dr. Bhambra. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Can you please speak?
Yes, I'm speaking. Is it not coming through?
Now it has come. Thank you.
Is it? Okay, good.
Please settle down. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin by introducing the speaker. The speaker today here is Dr. Gurminder K. Bhambra. She is a professor of historical sociology at the University of Sussex, and she has her research grounded in post-colonial theory, post-colonial sociology, historical sociology. Our topic of discussion today is colonialism and modernity, a post-colonial critique of sociology. So, Dr. Bhambra has authored a number of books. Some of them are Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, Connected Sociologies, Rethinking Modernity, and others. So please join me by welcoming Dr. Bhambra formally. Thank you, Dr. Bhambra, for joining us.
Thank you. Is it possible to share my screen?
So we made you the co-host. You can share your screen now.
Thank you.
So without further ado, Dr. Bhambra, over to you. I think we'll have a conversation with Dr. Bhambra for like 40 minutes, and then we'll move to question and answer session in the last 15 minutes. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. So can you see the PowerPoint okay? Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak to you here today. As has been mentioned, I'm a professor of historical sociology at the University of Sussex. For most of my academic career, I've been interested in the question between sociology and modernity. So I've just, is that better? Anyway, so what I've been looking at, or what I'm going to look at today, or talk to you about today, is the question of sociology and modernity as understood as co-constitutive. That is, sociology has both emerged out of the conditions of modern society, and it has seemed to be a distinctively modern form of explanation of that society. So in this talk, I will address the general relationship of sociology and modernity, before looking in more detail at the newer form of ideas of multiple modernities and the more far-reaching critique of post-colonial and decolonial theory. So, first of all, the thing to set out is that the dominant accounts of modernity within the social sciences rest on two fundamental assumptions. One is of rupture and the second is of difference. And there's an idea of temporal rupture that distinguishes between a traditional agrarian past and the idea of a modern industrial present. And there's a fundamental difference that distinguishes Europe from the rest of the world. Now, these assumptions demarcate the disciplines themselves, with sociology's remit having been understood to be the modern, while the traditional is seen to be the remit of anthropology. So you have this sense of the way in which the social sciences are themselves structured, are structured in relation to the modern being the remit of sociology, the traditional the remit of anthropology, and there is a sense that there are sociological laws that are common to both. Now, whatever the other differences the early sociologists had, what they understood was that they were living through a, or perhaps the, great transformation in history. And what they were concerned with was understanding how it had begun and influencing how it would be brought to the completion that they understood as inherent within it. And this was done through an engagement with the idea of historical stages. So once the general pattern of historical development was known, it was believed that the trajectory of development for other societies could be determined without direct research, as all human societies were deemed to follow the same pattern, one which had been established by Europe. So this builds on the earlier tradition of the Scottish Enlightenment, which developed understandings of progress within human societies in relation to ideas of successive stages of historical development. And it was taken up in the 20th century by sociologists such as Talcott Parsons, who argued that a common origin and a shared heritage allowed for the evolution of a European system of modern societies that could be understood in its entirety as differentiated from both earlier societies and from the rest of the world. More recently, Jürgen Habermas has argued for modernity to be understood as an unfinished project, where the future was not about the reproduction of the present, but was considered to be a space for the further development of projects and trends. The unfinished project, then, is the bringing to fruition of what is already predicated in the Western experience. So this is the sort of broad outline of the way in which sociology tends to be structured by understandings of modernity. And as I was mentioning, regardless of the other differences between theorists of modernity, whether, if we're thinking about terms of timing or its content or consequence, there are two things that all theories of modernity agree upon. And one is this idea of a temporal rupture, as I was mentioning, between a pre-modern agricultural past and a modern industrial future. And the other thing is this idea of spatial differentiation. So Europe and the West as understood to be different from the rest. The historical events that are associated with this more analytical understanding and that are seen to give credence to this understanding are generally understood as the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and they seem to be underpinned by a cultural revolution or a revolution in the system of knowledge and beliefs that's embodied in the Renaissance, for example. So you have the Renaissance and scientific revolution and the voyages of discovery that are seen to create a body of knowledge that had not been known to the ancients and that was seen to mark a new intellectual era. The French Revolution is seen to have created the institutions of the modern nation state, ideas of political modernity, and the Industrial Revolution has demarcated the capitalist industrial sphere from agriculture and is often seen by many sociologists as marking the modern discontinuity. Each of these events is understood to have its origins in Europe and to have developed endogenously. Each is posited as singular, that is unique and world historical, and as foundational to our understanding of the modern world. Western modernity is regarded as the original form, and a form that achieved expression without relation to others. So there's a very strong sense in the way in which the idea of modernity is understood within sociology more generally, that it's something that happens in Europe. And while the initial sociologists may have thought about it as a miracle of Europe, more recently sociologists have sort of thought, well, It's not a miracle of Europe, but nonetheless, there's still this sense that this miracle occurred in Europe. And so, whilst that explicit interpretive bias that links the emergence of modernity in Europe to an innate sense of superiority may be rejected by many theorists, the idea that the West is a special place, that is, that something happened in the West and of the West that needs explanation, remains very firmly in place. And yet, each of the events that we're talking about has other histories that could also be acknowledged. So, for example, if we're thinking about the Renaissance, the way in which the Renaissance often is talked about is that this was a period after the Dark Ages when scholars began to rediscover the texts of the ancients, and it generated a new time of learning and of thought and intellectual development. But if we look into it, the texts that are now being rediscovered, it's not as if they were buried in a basement and then people went and just found them again. These texts were circulating within the Islamic world. They were being engaged with, discussed, developed, and so on. And so when Europeans rediscovered these texts, they rediscovered them in part because Islamic scholars had been using them, engaging with them, and then engaging with Europeans, and that's how these texts come back into Europe. So the Renaissance isn't something that occurs in Europe as a consequence of Europeans. It's located in these broader connections and broader understandings. Similarly with the Industrial Revolution, often, when I do talks on the Industrial Revolution specifically, and I ask people, well, where does the Industrial Revolution begin? The argument or the thing that is often said is, well, the Industrial Revolution begins in Europe or it begins in Britain. And if I say, well, can you be a bit more specific? Where does the Industrial Revolution begin? And what people often say is, oh, well, it begins in Manchester. Why Manchester? Usually because of cotton. So there's an association between Manchester and cotton that is seen to be central to the making of the Industrial Revolution. And then I ask, well, where does cotton grow? Is it indigenous to Britain? Cotton doesn't grow in Britain. Cotton doesn't even grow in Europe. It comes from India, and as does the technology to dye and weave it. And Nutsa Patnaik, an economist, asks, it's rather odd that the Industrial Revolution is based on cotton, and yet cotton isn't even a plant that's indigenous to the areas where the revolution is supposed to have happened. And so if as a plant, it comes from the Indus Valley civilizations, the technology of how to dye and weave it goes from there to Europe. Europeans take the plant to the Americas. They establish it there in plantations which are worked by Africans who are taken as part of the Atlantic trade in human beings and forced to labor on plantations. That cotton is then taken to Manchester and turned into a cloth, and that cloth is sold around the world, usually at the point of a gun at that point, because this cotton was often of much inferior quality than that was produced within the subcontinent. And so in a sense, this idea of the Industrial Revolution as something that happens in Manchester and then from there spreads to the rest of the world, there's a misunderstanding to the extent that it's the rest of the world that enables the Industrial Revolution to be able to happen within Europe. Then we can also take into account the French Revolution. This is again another key factor within the histories of modernity and within sociological accounts of political modernity particularly. And the idea is that with the French Revolution, what you had for the first time was the overthrowing of feudalism, the establishment of the idea of people as citizens, and the emerging notion of democracy, where everybody is able to participate in the political decisions of the societies within which one lives. What is very rarely discussed at the same time is the fact that France wasn't, there wasn't simply a revolution in France, but in the French colonies, namely Haiti, and Haiti at that time was known as Saint-Domingue, there was a revolution also in the colonies, and the revolution there was a revolution against French colonial rule. So at the same time as the French are revolting in terms of wishing not to be part of oppressive political systems within the context of France, people in the colonies are fighting against French rule, including after the revolution, and arguing for the need for independence within their own lands as well. And there the revolution was both against French colonial rule and against French enslavement. And so this was a revolution by people who had been enslaved, who sought to assert their liberty in the process of the revolution. And the revolutionary period in Haiti occurs at the same sort of time as the French Revolution, and an independent state, Haiti, is established in 1804. And yet the Haitian Revolution very rarely makes it into discussions of sociological accounts of modernity or of democracy. More usually, we have the French Revolution and the US Revolution, but both those revolutions maintained slavery and colonial domination, whereas the Haitian Revolution, I would argue, was much more radical because it not only argued for political participation by all, but actually overturned the processes of colonization and enslavement in the process. And so what I'm pointing to here is the fact that the way in which modernity comes to be presented within sociological accounts is usually in terms of a history that is parochially European. Once we begin to unpack that history and begin to think about the events that are being presented, we recognize that there are global connections that actually enable these events to occur, and that there are also other events that are happening. And so in this sense, from the lost texts being brought back into Europe, from the fact that the emergence of states and political modernity isn't peculiarly European, to the fact that the Industrial Revolution itself could not have happened without its broader global connections with cotton taken from the Indus Valley civilizations through to its establishment on plantations, that in a way what postcolonial critique has opened up is the possibility of engaging with these broader contexts and then to rethink what the significance of the standard accounts of modernity have been. So there's been this critique for a while now within sociology, and it comes partly out of development studies. It comes also out of the humanities, where you had scholars like Edward Said and Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, and others questioning the assertion of value being associated with particular events, and also questioning the silences that exist in other events. And we might ask the question, what are the reasons for this silence? There's a silence of the past, but there's also a silence of the present. The Haitian Revolution was known about at the time, but it doesn't come to be part of the standard accounts that are presented in terms of how and why we might think about revolutionary movements and so on. So an event which happened and was known about is written out of our standard accounts and then becomes silenced in that process. Now, what I want to do next is talk a little bit about how this has developed within sociology in particular. So what I've set out initially is this sense of the relationship between sociology and modernity more broadly. And then what we have is that there's a sense of how this idea of modernity comes to be particularly articulated within sociology. And in the post-war period, in the 1950s and 1960s, you have the development of modernization theory. And what modernization theory set out was that it had an idea of change where there was a standard notion of a linear movement from a traditional past to a modernized future. So once you begin to have the idea of the Industrial Revolution being the key moment of change, what you also have then is the sense that the rest of the world will eventually change and come to look like the industrialized world. And so modernization theory was an attempt to understand how the differences among societies as constituted through their traditions would eventually be erased through the process of global diffusion of institutions that was seen to emerge from the West. So you had scholars such as Rostow and Lerner who believed that the Western processes of modernization should be used as the basis of a model of global applicability, and that other societies could be classified in terms of their relative modernization in comparison with this model. So there was a sense that whilst becoming modern in the first instance might derive from peculiar circumstances, which were seen to be historically contingent and perhaps even unlikely. So if you've looked at Weber's study of the Protestant ethic, there was a sense within his work that capitalism wasn't something that was necessarily going to happen, but that it occurred as a consequence of historically contingent and quite unlikely changes in ideas, which lead then to the development of changes within the material world. And so, but there was a sense that once this had happened, and it was believed to have happened within Europe, that Europe could now show the way to the rest of the world. But over time, particularly after the 60s and 70s, modernization theory was gradually replaced by dependency theory and world systems theory, which contested the linearity of earlier explanatory models and argued for more complex understandings of global economic systems. And then the fall of European communism in the 1990s really challenged these sensibilities. And for a number of commentators, the convergence thesis, which was this idea that differences would eventually be discarded, turned out to be confirmed, with Fukuyama most famously proclaiming a new end of history. So there was a sense that, now it wasn't, if there was a universal model, why wasn't this universal model in existence across all societies? And so this is when you have the shift from modernization theory to multiple modernities within sociology. And in part, multiple modernities emerged as a consequence of an unease that sociologists felt about the idea that you could have just a singular uniform trajectory that would be applied to the diversity of societies within the global world. And what scholars such as Eisenstadt and Schluchter argued was that the hegemonic and homogenizing tendencies that had been attributed to the project of modernization hadn't actually borne out convergence, not even in the West itself. And so how could this be explained? And they sought to explain it by developing this new theory of multiple modernities. And what they said was that actually two fallacies need to be avoided. The first, which was associated with earlier modernization theories, is that there's only one modernity. So they're saying that earlier modernization theory had the idea that there was only one modernity and that that's problematic. The second fallacy, which they attributed to postcolonialism, was that looking from the West to the East was necessarily a form of Eurocentrism. They said that while the idea of one modernity, especially one that had already been achieved in Europe, would be Eurocentric, theories of multiple modernities must nonetheless take Europe as a reference point, because it was just historically true that modernity had emerged first in Europe. And so whilst they pointed to a problem of Eurocentrism in earlier writings, they did so at the same time as asserting the necessary priority to be given to the West in the construction of a comparative sociology of multiple modernities. So there's this sort of interesting development that occurs where there's a recognition of the problems of modernization theory itself as being Eurocentric, but the development of multiple modernities suggests that simple plurality addresses the issue of Eurocentrism. And I would argue that this in itself remains problematic, because the focus on non-European modernities, in their view, is all about difference, is all about difference from what seemed to be the original modernity. But their idea of that original modernity is based on what I've already set out around the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And so their argument was that, you know, this modernity happened, and as this modernity engaged with other places, it generated multiple modernities. So places don't necessarily become like Europe, they become different to Europe. But in that process, they don't admit that other places had an impact on that original form of modernity. And in terms of the structure of multiple modernities itself, it's somewhat ironic that Eisenstadt argues that the first radical transformation of modernity occurs with the expansion of modernity in the Americas, and that then the other alternative distinct types are the communist Soviet type and the fascist National Socialist type. So not only modernity, but multiple modernities are seen to have their origin in the West. And so I would suggest that this is really quite problematic in the sense that it simply repeats the arguments that are being made within the standard accounts, but now simply argues for there to be plurality. And I don't see plurality as the solution to a problematic account of modernity itself. So there have been quite a few different types of critiques that have been made of the standard accounts. From within the African context in particular, there were arguments around indigenization that were made by scholars such as Akiwowo, Taiwe, Adesina, and Sitas. Then from the broader sort of Asian context, you had the development of ideas of alternative or autonomous sociologies by people like Syed Hussein Alatas and Vinitha Sinha, amongst others. And then there's also been this idea of a multicultural sociology, which has been developed more recently by people like Sujatha Patel and Raywin Connell. And in part, what they've sought to counter by developing these alternative accounts of sociology is to point to what is missed within the standard European accounts. All of them draw upon local examples. They ask us to consider how histories in other parts of the world ought to also be taken into account in the development of sociological concepts and understandings. I think all of them are doing excellent work. I would still have a concern with this presentation of what I've called broadly multicultural social science, is that what it does is argue for something as additional. And again, it's not about reconstructing the standard understandings of sociology. It's about simply creating space for other understandings of sociology. And that's also important. But I think what I've been focused on more centrally in my own work has been to identify what I see as problematic within the standard account itself and seek to reconstruct that at its very root. So I'm not arguing for anything additional to the standard account. I'm suggesting that the standard account itself has been problematically constructed, and what we need to do is to reconstruct that account. And here I draw upon the work particularly of scholars from postcolonial studies more broadly. So we have the classic work by Edward Said, his book on Orientalism, Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture, and Spivak's work around Can the Subaltern Speak, and other essays that she's also written. And I think together with this, the other school of work, which is decolonial theory, which comes a little bit later, what's been really important about the arguments made within postcolonial studies has been this sense of demonstrating the parochial character of arguments of an endogenous European modernity. And in their work, they've opened up the question of the production of knowledge, how is knowledge produced, who produces knowledge, for what purpose is that knowledge produced. And what Homi Bhabra in particular has presented is this idea that what we need to do is to disrupt standard discourses of modernity by shifting the frame through which we view the events of modernity and questioning what we consider those events to be. So our understanding of modernity looks as it does if we start from the French Revolution. However, if we were to start from the Haitian Revolution, we would have a very different understanding of modernity. This isn't a version of multiple modernities, but it's asking, how does taking the Haitian Revolution seriously enable us to rethink what it is that we have understood modernity to be? So in this way, we are able to interrogate the conceptual paradigm of modernity from the perspective of those who've been relegated to the margins, if they've been included at all. And so what Bhabra says is that it's important to take responsibility for the unspoken, unrepresented pasts within our present, and by understanding them, reconfigure what it means to be modern. And this reconstruction doesn't relegate difference simply to cultural expression, but it calls upon that difference to make a difference to the narratives of modernity that are already in place. So this is what I've drawn particularly from postcolonial studies. And then there is also a school of decolonial studies, which comes in the wake of postcolonial studies. And here, decolonial scholars are much more focused on thinking about the relationship between Latin America and Europe, the Caribbean and Europe, whereas postcolonial studies had been much more linking the Middle East, Asia with Europe. So they're coming from a different geographical standpoint. They're also usually extending the temporality of their concerns further back. So starting with the symbolic figure of Columbus, for example. What people like Anibal Quijano have argued is that the only way to understand modernity is to understand it in the context of the coloniality with which it's bound up. And so the 16th century conquests of the lands that we now call the Americas led to the development of a new world order that has encapsulated the whole planet. And the coloniality of power that comes to be expressed through the political and economic spheres, he would argue, is also associated with the coloniality of knowledge or of imagination that comes to be articulated as modernity or rationality. So the modernity that Europe takes as the context for its own being, Quijano argues, is also deeply imbricated in the structures of European colonial dominance that it's impossible to separate the two. Hence, he has the term modernity/coloniality, saying that there's no way ever to understand modernity without recognizing the coloniality that is central to it. So this understanding also enables a critique of the European paradigm of modernity, and it enables it to be seen as more than just a simple refutation of modernity, but presents a more complicated and complex definition of it. And so this idea of the mutual constitution and also the extension of the time frame back to the 15th century are two of the key contributions that are made by Quijano to its reconceptualization. And this is work that Walter Mignolo and Maria Lugones have also been part of in terms of developing this particular paradigm. So I want to end then by sort of saying, that in part what I've tried to do in this talk is just set out the standard accounts of sociology and modernity, talk about some of the ways in which these come to be developed within the sociological tradition, and point to some of the critiques that have been made, and also to distinguish between the critiques, to suggest which I think offer the possibility of a more far-going deconstruction and then reconstruction, and to argue that I think the insights of postcolonial theory in particular have had the most purchase, for me at least, in terms of the work that has been needed to undo the dominant accounts and then provide the basis of reconstructing them. And in using this work, I've developed an idea of connected sociologies in which I argue that, so as I was saying before, within standard histories, modernity is seen to come about because of the French and Industrial Revolution. But more critical work also looks at the processes of dispossession, of enslavement, of appropriation, of colonialism, and to be able to sort of think about the broader context within which the singular event is located enables us to have a much richer understanding of that event. And I would suggest a more adequate understanding of that event if we're wanting to understand how the histories of that event continue to have consequences in the present. Now, this isn't an argument for plurality. This isn't an argument for multiple modernities or alternative modernities or any of those forms. It is an argument to reconstruct our understandings that are seen to be central to the social sciences in order to be able to rethink the concepts and categories that are central to the social sciences. Why do I think this is important? Well, because these concepts, the histories that we acknowledge, shape the way in which those concepts have use in the present. If the histories are parochial, if they're incomplete, if they don't capture fully what was going on, then the concepts that we develop on the basis of that are also going to be problematic. And so by acknowledging these broader histories, by opening up to examination these events and processes, would hopefully enable us to reconstruct also our concepts such that we could mobilize them to better understand the world that we're in and to better intervene within it. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really happy to take any questions and comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhambra. I'm afraid anyone who would want to ask any questions must come here. I will have to come here. Anybody? Anyone have any questions? Okay, sir.
First of all, thank you for this insightful talk. I was just wondering, can we say that had there been no intervention from colonial powers to, for example, India would have developed its own modernity? So can we say that colonization of Asia, for example, and Africa, it basically hampered the development of the indigenous modernities? So thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I mean, I think, so if we look at this historically, one of the things that we see is that the consequence of colonization was to establish extensive drain from the Indian subcontinent to Europe. So the amount of wealth that was taken out of India as a consequence of colonization is what has led to chronic poverty and inequality within the region. And it's what's enabled the wealth of other places. So when we're looking at the question of poverty or inequality, none of these things are natural. They're historically produced. And the wealth of Europe is produced by the production of poverty in other places. And that's a relationship that we have to take account of. And I don't think the social sciences takes account of that adequately. So arguments around development studies, it's all about, oh, how can we help you to become more developed? It's like, well, perhaps you could acknowledge how you became wealthy by taking all our resources in the first place. That would be so colonialism has to be central to our understandings of these questions. And if we look at the social sciences more broadly, they very rarely engage with colonial histories at all. And so that's why I'm saying that the social sciences themselves need to be reconstructed by putting colonial histories at their heart. and then rethinking how we use them to think about these things otherwise. So yes, I think the world would have looked very different if European colonialism had not happened.
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for taking the time for this talk. I think it was really interesting, especially as a sociology major. So my question for you is, in your critique of traditional sociology, how do you suggest that contemporary sociologists or even students can effectively decolonize their research methods and curricula to better account for the colonial histories and their impact on modernity as it is? Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think one of the things is always just that there has to be an accounting for colonialism and what it is that you're wishing to engage with or to think about. And so, in that sense, if you start from if you take a concept, if you're working within sociology and you're taking a concept or you're taking a particular framing, say the state, for example. So I've just been doing some research on the state. And the standard accounts of the state are to think about processes that happen internal to it that enable it to be developed in particular sorts of ways. And yet no state was a closed, hermetic entity. All of them were engaged in relations of domination and so on with other places. So how do those relations have an impact on the development of the state such that we could understand the state? Not in terms of the changes that are occurring internal to it, but in those connections. So that's what I would say, that with any sort of sociological work that's being done, one has to ask the question of how would acknowledging a colonial history enable us to reshape the concepts that we're using. And that will probably be different in different issues. I don't think research methods themselves are necessarily problematic, but we have to think about the frame that has us develop our questions and our ideas and the work that we go on to do in relation to that. So I just think there has to be a questioning of the discipline at the same time as we use what is useful from the discipline to do the work that we're wanting to do.
Hello. I don't want to do any devil's advocacy, but I think in one sense, when we're thinking about the effect of colonialism, especially on the indigenous configuration of uh, the Indian state and the areas that form the erstwhile British India, right? We sometimes, as researchers, tend to miss out on the pre-colonial configurations of power which existed, which the colonial powers came into power and had to deal with. And oftentimes it meant, supporting or co-opting some of the elites which were already beneficiaries in, for example, the Mughal Empire. If we look at the Mansabdari system, for example, on the one hand. On the other hand, as someone dealing with colonialism in Pakistani academia for the last 10, 12 years, I do sense that there's in one way, post-colonial studies, and Afia Shermanozia has also made this argument, has been hijacked by right-wing intellectuals of a particular kind, who go back to a very, I would say, reactionary way of looking at things. Because otherwise it's just a counterfactual, right? What happened if the Britishers hadn't come into power? So your comments on that, please, this way with some of the work like from Humaira Iqtidar and stuff, which has been emerging in the last 10 years as well. I think that needs to be criticized as well in some ways.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think this is a really important question. And I think that post-colonial studies will be deficient if it cannot set out the boundaries of what it is that it's supposed to be for, if you want to put it in this way. I think the appropriation of that discourse within particular political groupings has been deeply problematic. And again, one way in which we can address this is through doing the work. So one project I'm working on at the moment is a project around the varieties of empire. And so one of the arguments, or the argument I'm making, is that I don't think all empires were the same. There were different types of empires, and I'm creating a distinction between empires of incorporation and empires of extraction. Within the empires of incorporation, I would put empires such as the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese Empire. The empires of extraction were very particular empires which developed out of European national projects which sought to establish colonies in other places, and their primary logic was a logic of extraction. And in an article I'm writing at the moment, I'm comparing the Mughal Empire and the British Empire in the context of how they addressed and dealt with famines and food scarcity. And one of the things that we see is that the Mughal Empire, because it was based in the subcontinent, it operated in that area, but it also saw itself as having a responsibility to the population within the area, so that when there were food scarcities or food shortages, there was an attempt to mitigate taxes, to distribute food from one area to another area in which it was needed, and so on. And we contrast that with what the British do. The logic of the British Empire in India was a logic of extraction. There was no sense that the taxes that they were taking from the population, that they had any accountability to the population in relation to that. Yes, they mobilized elites, and we have to look at the way in which the elite participation in that empire is also problematic. So I'm not talking about post-colonial innocence or anything like that. There has to be an acknowledgement of that. But one thing that is different is that the logic of extraction meant that the British took resources out of India and took grain away from starving populations. They didn't redistribute it amongst them. And so in that way, we can see that this argument that's being made within India at the moment around the need for a double decolonization from the British and the Mughal empires is completely false, because the Mughal Empire just did not operate in India in the way that the British Empire did. You're comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. And that work needs to be done to distinguish between them, whilst at the same time also acknowledging the fact that when the famines did occur, 90% of the people who died in famines were from the Dalit class or the lower classes and so on. The upper classes did not die from famine in the same way as the poorer sectors of the communities did. And that's also the need to sort of question that the establishment of a caste hierarchy as also complicit in the disproportionality of deaths that go on. So I think these things are complex, but it doesn't mean that we can't look at all of them and that we can't distinguish between the way in which some of this research is mobilized in order to facilitate division, or if it's being mobilized to create a world that works for all of us. And I think the mobilization of post-colonial theory to establish division is problematic in its own terms, but it's also empirically false once we begin to do the work to unpick those sorts of claims. So yes, we need to be aware of that, but I don't think that there's any shred of truth to those arguments that are being made and the way in which it's being mobilized.
Thank you. I think, Dr. Bhambra, can you see the questions in the chat?
Yep, I can.
Would you like to answer them, please?
Yep, let me just have a read. So, I mean, in this, so in a sense, I guess part of my response would be that I don't see modernity as something that's a natural condition or that had to happen or was always going to happen. my argument is partly that what we understand as modernity is actually colonialism, but it gets called modernity within a European tradition, because to call it modernity makes it positive in some sense, whereas if one were to acknowledge the colonial histories, one would have to acknowledge it as problematic. And so colonialism is a historical process. It radically transforms the world, not just the areas that are colonized, because it establishes forms of global inequality which are organized in terms of, as I was saying before, the wealthy parts of the world today are not wealthy because of any natural qualities of those areas. They're wealthy because they engaged in colonization and they extracted those resources from other places. So if you're asking the question, well, what is the way forward from here? Well, the argument I would make is around this notion of connected sociologies, to which I've been developing that in recent work around the notion of reparative sociology. So a reparative sociology is a sociology that takes into account the histories that have produced the inequalities in the world today and that seeks to repair them. So what work of repair would be needed in order to make the world a world that worked for all of us? And so I think that would be the point forward, that we have to accept that colonialism is something that happened. It's created the world that we're currently living in. If we think that there are aspects that are problematic to this world, what is it that we need to do to repair it? And that's the way forward, I would suggest.
Shaisa, you have a question? Ajay?
Another thing I was just thinking, that can we take insights from critical theory, Frankfurt School people, to develop a philosophical basis of, modernity? And similarly, there are very different perspectives who have tried to understand modernity, and we may not agree with them. For example, the traditionalist school of René Guénon, for example, and the author, I just forget his name, Wael Hallaq, for example, in his work on Orientalism. I just forgot the name of him, the author of Impossible State, but his work on Orientalism Restated. Sorry. So he has a chapter on René Guénon. So what is your response on these kind of philosophical attempts to understand modernity?
I think so. Again, I have worked on the Frankfurt School as well, and I think that there's a limitation to the extent that they don't recognize colonialism as central to modernity. I don't see that there is anything to modernity outside of colonialism, because everything that constitutes modernity as it's articulated within Europe has only been made possible because of European colonialism. And if you're not going to take colonialism into account in thinking about how your society has been developed as a consequence of that, then that will only ever be a limited and parochial view. So there's a real failure within European sociology and sociology more broadly, I would argue, to take colonialism into account in thinking about how the very structures of knowledge production, such as the disciplines within which we work, have been shaped by colonialism, but without any accounting for that colonialism within their conceptual organization. So even philosophically, I don't understand what a philosophical account of modernity that didn't address colonialism, what use it would be.
So anyone else?
Assalamu alaikum. The question I had was on identity formation and colonization. We study so much about decolonization, and now we're studying about multiple modernity theories. But the thing is, in the modern era, there's sort of like a pick and mix culture. And that culture is dominated by Western ideologies. So in a way, it's systemic colonization of our thoughts that's still going on, despite the fact that we're sitting here and studying decolonization theories. Number one, how do we get out of it? And number two, what do you have to say about that?
I mean, I can only say that I agree. And how we get out of it, I remember reading something like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Like, we just have to do the work. The work might seem immense, but then we have to think that the structures of knowledge production that we're working within, they came into being, say, with Columbus, use that as a symbolic starting point, 1492. So it's been 550 years that this way of thinking, this justification, this elision of colonialism has been going on. And when Europeans colonized, they didn't just colonize the materials and the people, they colonized minds as well. I mean, we're talking in English. That's part of colonization. But it enables us to communicate, at least. So we're communicating, but we can use that communication to undo the work that's been done to get us to where we are. So I don't think there's the possibility of recovering a pristine past. I think that's a really dangerous way of thinking, and it's a very dangerous politics, this idea of recovering purity or pasts or untouched. The world is as it is. The question is, what do we need to do today to make the world livable? And I think in terms of, so perhaps thinking about it in terms of very concrete issues like climate change. The societies that produce the consequences of climate change very rarely suffer the effects of it. So where the effects of climate change are being felt are amongst those communities that have done the least to affect these sorts of changes. So what responsibility do people have who aren't suffering these things, but who have caused these things, to address these things? How do we change the argument so that we recognize that those of us who live in places like Britain take a responsibility to ensure that the world works for all of us? And until we recognize the connections between us, we can just say, oh, well, that's a problem for over there, or that's their issue, or it's got nothing to do with us. But actually, all of this has been produced through these connected histories, and we have a responsibility to address the consequences of them. And
Thank
how
you so
we
much.
do that, we just do it every day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhambra. I approached you randomly and you graciously accepted. That's very, very kind of you. I am actually really inspired of your work. I just want to end this session on a lighter note. I hope the subaltern is finally able to speak. So thank you very much. I think we should give a big round of applause to Dr. Bhambra. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Good day. Bye. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you keep joining us in